Good evening. Welcome to Indiana Landmark Center. I'm Suzanne Stanis, Vice President of Education for Indiana Landmarks. And I also want to welcome our Zoom audience in attendance. For those of you on Zoom, if you have questions, please answer them or ask them in the Q&A feature, and we will answer them as time permits. Also, at the end, when we take questions, please wait until someone brings a microphone to you, because otherwise the people on Zoom won't be able to hear the questions. And I want to encourage you all to do your holiday shopping tonight in our lobby. We've got both volumes of Dr. Glass's book available on sale, as well as gift memberships for Indiana Landmarks. We think that's a wonderful opportunity to share your passion for historic preservation with your friends and family. So with that, I will turn it over to Brad Ward, President of Indiana Landmarks.
All right. Well, good evening. Good evening. Thank you for braving the cold and joining us tonight. As she said, Brad Ward, President here at Indiana Landmarks. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have had the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Glass before? All right, very good. Well, that makes my job a lot easier when trying to introduce this man. I do want to say that on the way in today, I was listening to NPR, and they reminded me that on this day in 1969, PBS had their first premiere of Sesame Street. And it made me realize, yes, on so many levels, that's correct. But it made me realize, Dr. Glass is kind of like what Jim Henson was to me as a child in terms of all the things that I needed to learn to be an effective kid growing up. Only now in the world of architecture, historic preservation, and all things Indianapolis. And so it goes without saying, his resume certainly does speak for itself, but this is a man that I think we all share great esteem for in terms of what he brings to us in terms of the significant volume of research that he has done. And it goes without saying that he doesn't just do it here in Indianapolis. This is a man that's traveled the world and has done this for countless other places. But just as a way of remembering his earlier career and the influence that he's had here on historic preservation, he was twice the director of Indiana Division of Historical Preservation and Archaeology. He was the deputy state historic preservation officer 13 years with Ball State University as their graduate program lead, and the founder for the Center for Historic Preservation, which we still benefit greatly from today in their work across the state. I will say that, as Suzanne said, we've got books in the lobby. Those are just one significant contribution he's made to what we know today as far as the history of Indianapolis. But it also goes to say that he spent 16 years writing monthly for the Indianapolis Star, the Indy Star, and I can only imagine the depths of those types of stories. And I'll close by just simply saying, I'll let you decide which character he best represents from the Sesame Street characters. My money might be on Kermit the Frog, because I don't know anyone who is kinder and more of a sensible leader, but he certainly is patient. If you've had to endure the questions I've had for him, he certainly wins the Kermit the Frog Award for most patient with me. So with no further ado, please welcome Dr. Glass to the stage.
Thank you, Brad. Testing, 1, 2, 3, back row. How are we doing? Okay, very good. Thank you, Brad, for that very nice introduction. That's a special introduction. And I'm most impressed with the leadership you're giving Indiana Landmarks, and really happy to have you here. And I also want to thank the staff of Indiana Landmarks and Indiana for all the support and encouragement you've given me on the books and for these lectures and presentations I've given. I want to recognize Suzanne Stanis, the Vice President of Education. Where is she? Over here. Thank you for all your support and all the other Landmark staff that are backing us up tonight. And it's a pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues here tonight, as Brad said, on a cold night, and be here in the Indiana Landmark Center and talk to you tonight about classical architecture in Indianapolis. I think we need to begin with a working definition for classical architecture, and I would propose this one. Architecture in which elements of Greek or Roman architecture are revived. And in pursuing that definition, we're going to be looking at the following topics. We're going to begin with a brief survey of Greek architecture, and then an equally brief one of Roman architecture. We're going to see how classical elements, mainly Roman, appeared in Italian Renaissance architecture. Then we're going to the United States to look at classical architecture in this country from about 1795 to 1860. We're going to then bring it home to Indianapolis and look at classical architecture here between 1831 and 1860. Then we're going to have a chapter in which there was relatively little classical architecture designed or built in Indianapolis from about 1860 to 1893. And then finally, what you might call the golden age of classical architecture in Indianapolis, 1893 to 1930. Now, as in previous presentations, if you see a cross beside the name of a building, that means it's a demolished building. Let's then begin with Greek architecture. I think most everyone's aware of the Parthenon that crowned the Acropolis in ancient Athens, classical Greece, 5th century BC. It's really the epitome, isn't it, of the Greek architecture broadly and of Greek temples. This view of the eastern facade of the Parthenon, the building was built between 447 BC and 432 BC. Iktonos and Kallikrates were the architects. And the thing I want to note in particular is the crisp sculptural quality of these Greek Doric columns on the facade, and equally the elements above in the architrave and the frieze. Let's take a look at a restored version of the west facade to appreciate it better. We're going to begin with the Greek Doric columns, with the abacus, the square abacus at the top of the capitol, then a molding called an echinus, then fluted shafts with entasis sometimes, a slight entasis or bulging convex outward, and then no bases to the columns. Above that is this horizontal zone called an architrave, and then above a frieze with these vertical elements called triglyphs, and then metopes in between the triglyphs, which in this case had bas-relief sculptures by the renowned sculptor Phidias. Above that is a triangular pediment with more of Phidias's sculptures. The other thing I want to comment on at this point is this symbolizes the Greek preference for a trabeated system, that is post and lintel, to span spaces. So we have the vertical elements, the columns supporting the horizontal elements, the lintel. This is a plan of the Parthenon, and the first thing I want to note is this had a peripteral colonnade. What's a peripteral colonnade? It's a colonnade. We have, what happened? There it is, okay. We have a peripteral colonnade. That means there's full scale columns on all four sides of the temple, extra row on either end, peripteral. Then there's an inner structure called the cella, and part of that had the statue of Athena. And then on all four sides, there were steps leading up to the temple. Very close to the Parthenon is the Erechtheum, also built in the 5th century BC. And in this building and a few others, the Greeks introduced their second order, classical order, which was the Ionic order columns. If we look around the corner, we can see a full portico has survived, supported by Ionic columns, supporting this entablature with a flat roof, no pediment. And if we look at a drawing of an Ionic order, a Greek order, we can notice the elements at the very top. They have the capital formed by these volutes or scrolls that are symmetrically disposed equally on either side. Then there's an echinus molding, and then a fluted shaft without entasis, and then bases called toruses on Ionic columns. And then in the architrave, we have these three horizontal bands typical of Ionic architecture. The third order of column that the Greeks introduced was the Corinthian column. And one of the earliest examples appeared in the Temple of Apollo at Bayh, late 5th century BC. We can see that the colonnade on the outside is peripteral, consisting of Greek Doric columns. But within, there was a cella, and the cella corridor was lined by these large Ionic columns engaged, which means they're attached to the wall. At the very end of this corridor was a single Corinthian column which had a fluted shaft like the Ionic order, a base, a torus base, but a very different type of capital with these elongated volutes supporting the abacus, and in between acanthus leaves. Now, after the classical period, which is the 5th century BC, more periods of Greek domination and cultural things in architecture. And one of the notable monuments that has survived in Athens is the Choragic Monument of Lysicrates, dating from 334 BC. It introduced the idea of a cylinder bounded by Corinthian columns supporting an Ionic entablature, conical roof with a flourishing finial at the very top. This brings us to Roman architecture. And the first comment to make is the Romans borrowed a lot of Greek architecture, particularly in the early centuries of the Roman Empire. This is an example, the Temple of Fortuna Virile in Rome, late 2nd century BC. And you can see that immediately the Greek legacy in this temple front or portico, consisting of these Ionic columns supporting a full entablature and a pediment without statuary. The Romans often did not use statuary. Now, the Romans made some modifications too. There is no peripteral colonnade around on all 4 sides. There's only a portico on the front side, the facade side. The cella is brought out to the facade line on the sides. Also, the Romans put many of their temples on podiums, raising their heights, and the stairways only approach the frontal or the facade. We can see this even better in a much larger scale temple. This is a restoration model showing the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva in the 1st century AD on Capitoline Hill. You can see many of the same ideas, but in a larger scale with this Corinthian portico, Corinthian columns supporting architrave, and then this pediment, which does include statuary in this case. But look, there's no peripteral colonnade. There's only one portico in the building, and there's a frontal stairway. Now, the Romans were quite inventive themselves, and one of the most inventive elements that they used were arches and then also vaults. We can see the combination of Greek elements and the Roman contribution in the exterior facade of the Colosseum, dating to the late 1st century AD. And notice this trabeated form, columns supporting entablatures, that's a posted lintel. But in between, the architects employed rounded arches, and the combination, I think, is fairly harmonious. The other thing I would like to note is the Romans valued what they thought of as the hierarchy of order, proper hierarchy of orders. And so we have the Doric order belongs at the lowest level, succeeded by the Ionic order, and then finally the Corinthian order. One of the most monumental of all the Roman buildings, and by a miracle it still survives, it's one of the only major monuments in Rome to survive largely intact, is the Pantheon, built between 118 and 125 AD, and built by the Emperor Hadrian. This is notable because it combines 2 ideas: the Greek legacy of the temple front or portico, combined with a new Roman concept, namely a masonry cylinder and dome. Let's look at the columns first, because by this point, the Romans were using mostly colossal Corinthian columns with smooth shafts. And then you have a full entablature without sculpture, and then an immense pediment supported by S-shaped consoles, these are called, that line the pediment. And then if we take a look, looking above and looking down on a model of the restored building, we can appreciate better the Greek-inspired portico attached to this huge cylinder, masonry cylinder, the top of which is a low-profile dome consisting of a concrete shell with these concentric rings, which were added as buttresses. We go inside the Pantheon. The Pantheon is one of the very few major Roman monuments where the interior decorative scheme is intact. You can see the different colored marbles that came from different parts of the empire for the shafts of the columns and these panels. And then also these crisply sculpted Corinthian capitals in white stone. And then floating over all of it is this immense concrete shell dome with coffers, which the Romans didn't invent, but they exploited them. You have an outer square and then a series of smaller squares providing depth. We go forward 3 centuries, we see some of the same elements continue to be in Roman imperial architecture. Here is the frigidarium of the Baths of Diocletian, dating from the early 4th century AD, 300 years later. And immediately our attention is drawn to an element we've seen before, namely these colossal Corinthian columns with smooth shafts favored by the Romans. But in this case, something new. They have individual entablatures on both sides. And then look up, these immense windows, lunette-shaped windows, are thermal windows, letting an abundance of light into the former baths. This was later made into a Christian church. This brings us to the Italian Renaissance, and this was a period in which Italian Renaissance architects rediscovered Roman architecture, did excavation, measured drawings, appreciated them, and incorporated them into contemporary buildings. Let's look at a couple of examples. We look at the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, designed by an architect named Filippo Brunelleschi, where immediately our attention is drawn to these colossal Roman-style Corinthian columns with smooth shafts, very much with individual entablatures above, which should remind us of the baths of Diocletian, and then a flat wooden ceiling with Roman coffers. About 80 years later, an architect named Donato Bramante designed this building, the Tempietto in San Pietro Montorio in Rome, built after 1502. He took the idea of a masonry cylinder, like in the Pantheon, but instead of having a concrete shell, low-profile dome, he had a high hemispheric dome with a lantern, and then a screen of Roman Tuscan columns surrounding the base. I don't think there's any doubt that the most monumental of all the domes of the Renaissance was the dome of Michelangelo's St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. You look at this immense dome, and it has a high-profile hemispheric dome with ribs supporting the resisting the thrust, and then more buttresses styled as Corinthian columns, pairs of Corinthian columns at the drum, the base of the dome. And then look, Michelangelo has used colossal Corinthian pilasters, a legacy of the Romans, to adorn the sides of the basilica. Now we go north to Venice, northeast of Venice. We can see this monument, the Library of St. Mark in Venice by Jacopo Sansovino, begun in 1537. And I think you can probably see the legacy of the Colosseum on these two different levels, with the trabeated form of the Greeks supported by columns, and in between round arches on two different levels. Let's take a closer look. And we can certainly appreciate better. We have an observance of the hierarchy of orders, the Doric columns on the ground level, and then Ionic columns on the next level have a Greek entablature with triglyphs above the Doric level, and then Ionic architrave above here. And we can also appreciate better the arches between the columns. Now, one of the major ways in which the designs were being spread throughout Italy and ultimately through Europe was through architectural guides, in which architects presented their findings in terms of measured drawings and excavations. One of the most influential was Andrea Palladio's The Four Books of Architecture, published in 1570. And one of the sections of that book is devoted to his measured drawings of ancient Roman buildings, such as the Temple of Jupiter in Imperial Rome. Now, classical architecture, that is Roman architecture, continued to be exceedingly popular through the 17th and 18th century. But about the early 1750s, something new came on the scene, and this was architects from Northern Europe were visiting Greece and Athens and other points, ancient Greek ruins, observing the ruins firsthand, making measured drawings of them, and publishing them. A duo, the British architects Stuart and Rivette, made measured drawings, did restoration drawings, such as this one of the Parthenon, and published them in an influential book, The Antiquities of Athens. And this inspired a revival of Greek directly, not through the Roman lens or the Renaissance, in both Europe and the United States. This brings us to classical architecture in the United States from about 1795 to 1860. One of the first public buildings to have a classical portico was the First Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, built between 1796 and 97 and designed by Samuel Blodgett, Jr. I think you can see immediately the legacy of the Romans, can't you? This portico with these colossal Corinthian columns, with fluting in this case, supporting a full entablature and a pediment with consoles, and also these pilasters, these colossal Corinthian pilasters, the Roman legacy. A comment I'd like to make here, though, this is a modern building. This is a large rectangular banking building to which a portico has been attached. This is no effort to recreate a temple. And that's going to be the pattern we see going forward for the most part. The first architect widely conceded to have been professionally trained was Benjamin Latrobe from England. He settled in the United States. He won the commission to reconstruct the interiors of the U.S. Capitol after the British burned Washington in 1814. This is his design, an influential design of the original U.S. House of Representatives, which is now Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. He based this on a Roman building, the Roman building type, the Bouleuterium, which was a city hall or theater, in which you had a semicircular building, in which you had a semicircular screen of columns in the back, encompassing about 2/3 of the building, and then a semicircular dome with coffers above, and facing a stage in Roman times. Latrobe took all these elements to create a recreation for the U.S. House of Representatives chamber. So we see a semicircular screen of columns with marble and Corinthian capitals, a full entablature, and then a coffered half dome above, facing a line of columns with the dais and the speaker, and semicircular seating for the representatives. Now hold that image in mind because we're going to go back to that in a minute. One of the first public buildings to have a solely Greek-inspired architectural character was the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, built in 1818 and designed by William Strickland. I think you can see and appreciate the difference between the somewhat austere Greek architecture elements and the Romans that we've been looking at. This is a faithful recreation of Greek Doric columns, such as you might have found in the Parthenon and the portico. There are two porticos on either end of the building, an oblong-shaped building. And above the Doric columns are a blank architrave, and then the frieze with triglyphs, model on the Greeks, and then this projecting pediment without statuary. One of the couple differences, though, that Strickland made in terms of the Parthenon, say, is this is not a peripteral colonnade. This is only on the ends the columns appear. That's one thing. So the cell-up structure comes out to the facade lines on either side. And also, there's a stairway only on the front side, which emulates the Roman temple. About 20 years later, Strickland designed this building, the Merchants Exchange in Philadelphia in the early 1830s. And again, this is a modern building, a large rectangular mass to which he attached or added a semicircular pavilion fronted by a screen of these gigantic Corinthian columns with fluting. And above that, based loosely on the Couragic monument of Lysicrates, is this cupola. This brings us to finally to classical architecture. With that background, the classical architecture in Indianapolis between 1831 and 1861. We're going to begin with the first Indiana Statehouse in Indianapolis, built between 1831 and 35 and designed by the noted New York architects of Town and Davis. They won a national architectural competition. And their instructions from the state legislature stipulated that the ornament of the exterior walls was to correspond in character to the Doric order of the Parthenon in Athens. Pretty specific directions. So let's see how the architects did. Well, we have an oblong structure resembling the Parthenon. We have porticos resembling the Parthenon either end with eight Doric columns faithfully recreated, a Greek entablature with triglyphs and a pediment at either end. But look what has happened on the side. There's not a peripteral colonnade, is there? Instead, the architects used pilasters and brought the cella-like structure out to the facade line. The other thing is the dome. The dome has nothing to do with the Parthenon. It's from the Italian Renaissance. So we have a high-profile hemispheric dome, a lantern, and a drum with pilasters lining it. When we take a look at the plan of the main floor, here's the legacy of Latrobe. The architects designed two chambers very much like the Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. If you look at the House of Representatives, you can see the semicircular seating. At the back is a semicircular line of or screen of columns, another straight line of columns at this end that the chamber faces, and also the speaker's chair. A similar layout with the Senate, and in between a small rotunda. This inaugurated in Indianapolis a classical revival of both Roman and Greek elements for architecture. Let's begin with the headquarters building of the State Bank of Indiana that stood at Kentucky Avenue and Illinois Streets, built in 1839 and 40, and designed by the first practicing architect in Indianapolis, John Elder, who also designed all manner of building types during the 1830s and 40s. If we look at his building for the State Bank, we note there's much more legacy to the Roman temples than a Greek temple. Namely, we have a cella-like structure with a temple front on one end only. But look at the temple front. It's not at all like either Roman or Greek temples, in that there's only two freestanding columns at the center, behind which is a recessed porch. And then on the sides, instead of having full-scale columns, we have flat two-dimensional pilasters, Doric pilasters. So it's a decided change. Above that is an entablature and a pediment, in keeping with the Roman temple. And there's no, of course, there's no peripheral colonnade around the sides, which marks this as a Roman-style temple or Roman-style building, and then a stairway leading up to the temple front. Most probably, John Elder also served as the architect for the Second Presbyterian Church, which was built on the northwest corner of the Circle and Market Street, built at the same time, very similar design. Again, the legacy of a Roman temple. We see an oblong structure with the cella the walls coming out to the sides. There's no peripheral colonnade. We have a temple front on one side only. And the same formula as in the bank building. We have these two freestanding columns in the center, preceding a porch, recessed porch, and then these flat two-dimensional pilasters on either side, and then a full entablature and pediment above that, and crowning the roof is a lantern, is a belfry and lantern based on 18th century British churches. Across the circle, a year earlier, John Elder was designing a different kind of building, which has borrowed from both Greek and Gothic architecture in this combination. We have a cella-like structure with no peripheral colonnade whatsoever, not even on the facade, but we do have these gigantic Greek Doric pilasters on the corners, and a Ionic entablature, and then a pediment. Those are all Greek elements, but look, here we have Gothic windows, pointed arch windows on the facade and on the sides, and then a Gothic broach spire above. In the late 1840s, another architect came on the scene, Joseph Willis, most recently from Logansport. He obtained a commission to design the Masonic Lodge Hall, built by the Grand Lodge of the Indiana Masons on the southeast corner of Washington and Tennessee Streets. Tennessee Street's now Capitol Avenue. This was built in 1848 to 49. And I think you can see immediately that Willis, like Elder, is drawing from the same kind of sources resembling Roman temples. Have the cella-like structure in the back, and comprising about 2/3 of the building. But instead of a peripheral colonnade, we have pilasters on the side. And it's also like a Roman temple is on a podium, and it has a temple front only on one side. However, notice the differences. There is no stairway approaching the front. There are Greek Doric columns rather than Roman Doric columns constituting the portico, and a Greek entablature with these Greek triglyphs, and then a pediment above. Willis was fortunate to get a major commission almost exactly the same time. This was for the first of 3 benevolent institutions the state of Indiana built in the 1840s and 50s. Namely, this was the Indiana State Asylum for the Education of the Deaf and Dumb, which was constructed in the southeast corner of East Washington Street and State Avenue. It was built in 1849 to 50. And what Willis did, as with many institutional buildings at that time, no, I'm not. Excuse me, I want to go back. As with many institutional buildings of the time, he created an E-shaped plan in which you have a major central building containing classrooms and administrative offices, wings on either side that extend out to sub-pavilions at right angles to the original one. That's a basic plan, E-shaped plan. And then the Greek elements he added, namely this colossal 2-story portico with Greek Doric columns supporting a full entablature but a flat roof, no pediment. And then, as in Roman temples, a frontal stairway with wing walls on either side, colossal Doric pilasters on the corners of the main building, and more pilasters around this cupola, and then more colossal Doric pilasters lining 3 sides of these out pavilions with pediments above. And the second of these benevolent institutions, a much larger complex, was the Indiana Hospital for the Insane, that stood at 3000 West Washington Street, designed by John Elder. It took some years to complete, till 1868. but it has some definite similarities to the deaf and dumb asylum, doesn't it? Namely, we have the central administration building with a portico attached to it, and then wings that attach to additional pavilions at right angles, and another wing extending out some distance from the original building. Notice the similarity, the deaf and dumb asylum portico, a two-story portico with ionic columns and entablature with a flat roof, and then a stairway approaching the facade with wing walls on either side. A different kind of cupola on the top, but it does have Doric pilasters, and there are more colossal Doric pilasters on several sides of these out pavilions. Now, third benevolent institution was the Indiana Institute for the Blind, which stood on the north side of North Street between Meridian and Pennsylvania Streets. This was built between 1850 and 1853, and Francis Koskin, a noted architect, recently arrived from Madison, Indiana, was the architect. He has a little bit of different approach, some of the same elements. There is this very large central building containing offices and classrooms and dormitories, and then on either sides, these smaller wings that he placed on the building for additional space. The Greek and elements are immediately apparent and very similar to what we saw in the other two institutions, namely a two-story ionic portico with an entablature and flat roof, a frontal stairway with these wing walls that have these remarkable S-shaped volutes, sculptural volutes on either side. And then the other Greek element, a legacy of the Karajic monument Lysicrates, are three cupolas loosely based on the Karajic monument. And these have 8 sides with Corinthian columns lining them, and these very small diminutive pediments above, and then the smaller scale cupolas on either side. Now, Koskin also used such a cupola as the apex for the most popular hotel of the 1850s. That was the Bates House that stood at Illinois and Washington Streets, built between 1852 to 53. You can see that there is an 8-sided cupola with Corinthian columns lining it, and different types of pediments above. Now, the 1850s marked a boom, quite an economic boom in Indianapolis history. As a railroad came to town, there were railroad lines coming from all different directions, and quite an economic boom developed. And the depots and some of the factory buildings had classical elements. Let's use this as an example. This is the Madison Indianapolis Railroad Depot that stood on the south side of South Street, west of Delaware Street. This was built between 1846 and 47. Harry Elder was the architect, the son of John Elder. And look at this oblong-shaped building with a temple front at either end, consisting of Doric pilasters, this frieze, and then the pediment on either end, and then colossal pilaster without capitals on the corners. And then if we look at the Washington Foundry, we see an example of a brick factory building built by Passelman and Almus Vinton in 1852. It stood opposite the Union Depot, and we have a 2-story brick building with this temple front added to the facade, comprising the facade with these colossal Doric pilasters, an entablature, and then a vacant or empty pediment above. One of the most prominent citizens in town in the 1840s was the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. It is said that he built this house with his own hands, perhaps aided by John Elder. It stood on the south side of Ohio Street between Alabama and New Jersey Streets, built in 1846. And you see it's an oblong-shaped building, a simple building with frame, construction, clapboards, and on the ends are gables styled as pediments, and then these flat 2-dimensional pilasters without capitals. Now, an example of vernacular Greek architecture might be said to be this house, a farmhouse built by Ovid and Elizabeth McEwitt Butler at what is now 1306 North Park Avenue. It was the original section which we're looking at, was built in 1848. And here's the vernacular stylization. Look at the colossal Greek pilasters, Doric pilasters. The shafts are brick. We have the Doric capital modified creatively, and then the 2 pilasters on either side support a Greek pediment, below which is the entryway sheltered a porch with Roman Tuscan columns. This brings us to the period I mentioned earlier in which there was relatively little classical architecture applied to Indianapolis buildings from about 1861 to 1893, but there were a couple of examples, and let's take a look at them. First, let's look at the first Indianapolis Hebrew temple built in Indianapolis. It stood on the south side of Market Street, west of East Street, built in 1865 to 66. Isaac Hodgson was the architect. And the element I want to draw our attention to is this element called an edicule. An edicule was an invention of the Romans It had and consisted of having a single column, usually a single column or pilaster flanking a doorway or window, above which was an entablature and a pediment. All these elements are present in this edicule on the facade of the Hebrew temple, a Corinthian column on either side, and then a full entablature, and then a pediment with these characteristic consoles that we've seen since the Renaissance. I don't think there's any question that one of the most influential public buildings of the 19th century in the United States was the U.S. Capitol building. This shows the current design shows it as completed in 1864 and as designed by Thomas Eustace Walter. The first thing that dominates the building is the dome, modeled somewhat on the St. Paul's Cathedral in London and St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. We have this immense hemispheric dome, cast iron dome, below which is the drum, which is lined with a screen of colossal Corinthian columns, Roman Corinthian columns. More influence of Rome is on these three pavilions. It's sort of an E-shaped plan with a central pavilion and these projecting pavilions at the ends. And this one closer provides a little better detail for us to observe a temple portico from a Roman imperial temple. These colossal Corinthian columns support a full entablature. And then within this pediment is statuary, a little unusual, not always used, but in the case of the U.S. Capitol was used. And then colossal Corinthian pilasters, such as Michelangelo used in St. Peter's. Now, some of these elements were influential in the design of the second Indiana Statehouse in Indianapolis, built between 1878 and 1888. Edwin May and Adolph Scher were the architects. I can think you can probably see some similarities in the plan, the layout. Namely, we have sort of an E-shaped plan with much larger central pavilion than in the U.S. Capitol, but then these out pavilions at the end of wings on either side. Also, the central pavilion has a Roman temple portico, which is reflected more in two dimensions in this flat two-dimensional temple front, which is on two sides of this outlying pavilion. Also notice the dominance of the dome, although it's much smaller scale than U.S. Capitol. It is a hemispheric profile above and a drum lined by Corinthian columns. And then if we look head on to the east, you can appreciate better this Roman temple portico consisting of these colossal Roman Corinthian columns supporting an entablature, above which is a large pediment with consoles, and within is bas-relief sculptures which present the state seal of Indiana, and the whole stands on a podium like in a Roman temple. And over the sides, more of these colossal Corinthian pillars, ultimately going back to the Romans. There are two spectacular public spaces in the State House in particular. These are the atria. We're now looking at the north atrium. And here I want you to observe the Roman hierarchy of orders that the architects have observed. If we look down, we can see the Doric order in the lowest level, succeeded by the Ionic order and the Corinthian order, although in this case, each of these has individual entablatures, which goes back ultimately to the baths of Diocletian. At least one public building had Roman elements from the 1880s. This was Tomlinson Hall, which combined the functions of a city market and a convention hall. It stood at Market and Delaware Streets, built in 1885 to 1886. And Diedrich Bohlen was the architect. And what Bohlen did was he took above the three entryways, he applied a temple front with Ionic pilasters and this bas-relief sculpture within the pediment. And then look at this. On either side are large Roman thermal windows, and more of these outside the convention hall. This brings us to what you might call the golden age of classical architecture in Indianapolis from about 1893 to 1930. And one of the catalysts was the influence of the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, in which there were these immense plaster of Paris convention buildings, mainly designed to emulate classical buildings, particularly Roman buildings. We're looking at the Court of Honor, and at the end was the administration building designed by Richard Morris Hunt of New York with an immense dome derived from the Renaissance, below which is this pavilion with these colossal Corinthian columns standing in anise. More about in anise in a minute. And then the main pavilion has thermal windows on either side there. Another side of the court was one of the largest buildings inspired by Roman imperial architecture, namely the agricultural building designed by New York architects McKim, Mead, and White. Let's look at the central pavilion. and a lower profile Roman dome model somewhat on the Pantheon's dome. And then this pavilion below has these colossal Corinthian columns standing in annis. Now, what is in annis? In annis is when you have several columns standing in the facade line of the building, behind which is a porch or recessed area. On either side of these immense wings are trios of Roman thermal windows. Now, despite the fact that many of the exposition buildings were inspired by Roman architecture, there was at least one building inspired directly by Greek architecture, and this was the Festival Hall, designed by an architect, Francis Meredith Whitehouse. And look how Whitehouse has studied the Greek Doric order and the Parthenon and other Greek buildings, and created these Greek Doric columns standing in annis with a recession behind it, and then a proper Greek entablature with triglyphs above. Now, the elements of the influence exposition and the classical elements penetrated and influenced Indianapolis architecture in the 1890s gradually. As we can see in the Indiana National Bank building that was built on Virginia Avenue and Pennsylvania Street in 1896, and Oscar Bolin was the architect. You look at the facade, we see a temple front, sort of a shallow portico. You could also read this as an edicule, only with twin columns either side rather than a single one. And then on the side elevation, another kind of inventive use, we have an edicule with these pair of, instead of columns, as in the facade, we have flat two-dimensional pilasters flanking this recessed space, above which is an entablature and a pediment. But then look, in the recessed area, there are also these large Corinthian columns standing in annis. And there are also additional Corinthian pilasters on other sections of the exterior wall. Now, the gauge of the skyscraper in Indianapolis, as in other major cities, was between the 1890s and 1930s. The architects of these buildings were creating modern office buildings, but embellishing them frequently with classical elements, such as in the Board of Trade building that stood at Ohio and Meridian Streets, built between 1905 and 6, and designed by Indianapolis architects Brubaker and Eldridge. You can see the architects have used colossal Roman-style Corinthian pilasters in limestone to cover the first two stories. They support an ionic entablature with a slightly projecting cornice. The tallest and maybe the most majestic skyscraper of the skyscraper age in Indianapolis was the Merchants National Bank building, 16 stories tall. Now the Barnes and Thornburg building stands at 11 South Meridian Street. This was built between 1907 and 12. D.H. Burnham Company in Chicago, another top firm, were the designers. And you can see, if you look at the first three stories, that there are several classical details which they applied. And let's take a closer look to those. And you can see that the first two stories are graced by these colossal Doric pilasters, but there's some creative modifications that have been made to the capitals of the Doric pilasters by the architects, above which is an Ionic style architrave with disc applied, even larger discs between these trios of windows in the third story. And if we go inside the banking room, the lofty banking room in the Merchants National Bank building, we can admire influence of Greek Doric architecture and these tall columns that have a proper abacus and a chinas. And the top half is proper fluted Greek Doric column. But look at the lower half, smooth marble, dark marble. So the creative liberty is taken there. And above, Roman coffers. A building in which we see a little bit of the formula we saw earlier in the Colosseum applied. It was the Bob's Merrill building, which stood at 18 East Vermont Street, built between 1910 and 11, and designed by Indianapolis architects Foltz and Parker. We have a screen of Roman Tuscan columns supporting an architrave and a projecting cornice. But in between, we have these round-headed windows, large round-headed windows. So we have a combination of the Greek trabeated form, remember that, post and lintel, and the round-headed arch in between. The second largest, tallest skyscraper of the skyscraper age was the Fletcher Savings and Trust building that stands at Market and Pennsylvania Street. This was built between 1913 and 15. Electus Litchfield of New York came up with the original design. It was modified later by local architects Vonnegut and Bone. Let's take a look at the first three stories. Covered with pink granite from Maine, and we want to direct our attention to these colossal Ionic columns standing in annis, with a two on either side of the entryway grouped in that fashion. Interesting thing, and these have smooth shafts rather than fluted shafts, as is usually the case with Ionic columns. And there's also a slight convex character, bulge, like entasis in Greek Doric architecture. There is no entablature. That's a creative license taken by the architects. And look at a detail of the capital. You can appreciate the sculptural quality of the Ionic capital with these volutes. And within the volutes, between the volutes, is the echinus molding, in this case comprised of egg and dart molding from classical architecture. I think the most fabulous hotel ever built in Indianapolis was this hotel, the Clay Blue Hotel at Illinois and Washington Streets. The main part of this was built between 1901 and 3, designed by Dayton architect Frank Andrews. And I want to direct your attention to the top two stories, in which these are colossal Corinthian pilasters from Roman sources. But to get the full impact of classicism, you needed to go inside to the lobby, and you had this vision in front of you, these colossal Doric columns lining the lobby, the shafts of which were actually scagliola, which was a process by which plaster could be mixed. There's the shape of a column and then marbleizing on the outside. Above the columns were entablature with triglyphs, and at the very top, a flat ceiling with Roman coffers. A facade with Greek inspiration is the Circle Theater on Monument Circle, built in 1916, designed by Rubish and Hunter. You can see this is white, sparkling white terracotta. You can see these Greek Doric pilasters with the capitals modified creatively. At the center was a painting of a Grecian scene. And then this zone, a frieze, has Grecian figures in bas relief, a little bit like Phidias's frieze in the Parthenon itself. And above that, a pediment was supported by consoles, within which are more of these Grecian figures. I think the most elegant of all the classically inspired buildings in Indianapolis, and maybe in the state of Indiana, was and is the U.S. and now Birch Bayh Courthouse and Post Office at 46 East Ohio Street. This was built between 1903 and 5, Rankin and Kellogg of Philadelphia, where the architects won a national architectural competition. There's this warm Indiana limestone, the defining elements of which the architects made Ionic columns and pilasters. You can see these paired Ionic columns and gauge columns are attached to the wall, flanking this entryway, and then Greek Ionic pilasters. And then this screen of Ionic, some engaged columns on the south side. Let's take a closer look at that. Majestic, colossal in scale, this rhythmic line of columns, Ionic columns, standing in anise, above which is a full entablature and a projecting cornice. Now, what was the inspiration of the architects to use this in the courthouse? Well, I believe they were inspired by this building. The Ionic colonnade on the east facade of the U.S. Treasury Building in Washington, built between 1836 to 42, designed by Robert Mills, have the same rhythmic quality of these colossal Ionic columns supporting a full entablature. This is one of my favorite photos. On the left, we have architect Rankin. On the right, architect Kellogg posing with one of the Ionic capitals that they designed for the U.S. courthouse just before it's to be hoisted into place. If you go into one of the entry corridors, you can see Roman elements, namely a screen of Roman Tuscan columns standing in anise, above which is a frieze, an Ionic frieze here, and then the whole supports a Roman-style barrel vault with these coffers and rosettes. And one of the most spectacular interiors is the original U.S. District Courtroom, now William E. Steckler Courtroom. And I want to direct our attention to this Roman edicule at the head of the room, right above the judge's bench, and then these colossal pilasters in green marbleized quality with fluting. Really majestic space. Here's a building which, again, like in the Indiana National Bank, combines the ideas of an edicule and columns in anise. This is the Bonner Thompson Memorial Library, the Butler College, built in Irvington between 1901 and 3. Jesse Johnson of Indianapolis was the architect. And if we look for the edicule, we can see the pilasters, these Doric pilasters lining the outside of the edicule. There's a recession within, an entablature, and then a pediment with this very robust sculpture with a cartouche within. And then complementing that are these colossal Ionic columns standing in anise in this recession in the facade. Now, on the south side of Indianapolis in this period, a new university was being founded, the Indiana Central University. This was the main building, constructed, now good home, constructed on Otterbein Avenue in 1904-5 and designed by A.H. Elwood. The thing that draws our attention immediately is this colossal Ionic portico with these smooth shafted Ionic columns supporting an entablature with a flat roof, no pediment. However, look above. Elwood created a east-west pavilion above the portico, elevated above it, on top of which is a pediment. And if you walk back from the facade, the pediment seems to be floating above this portico. Quite an interesting solution for this design. More evidences of in anise. Let's look no further than the Masonic Temple. It stands at 525 North Illinois Street, built between 1907 and 8. Rubish and Hunter were the architects, and sure enough, we have these colossal Ionic columns standing in anise on three sides of the building with these large Doric pilasters in the corners. And just a year or so later, the architects used a very similar design for the Indianapolis City Hall at 202 North Alabama Street. This was built between 1909 and 10. And sure enough, we have got, this case though, Roman Doric columns, colossal columns, standing in anise on the facade and the other two side elevations with these large colossal Doric pilasters on the corners. This is a rendering that the architects made before the construction of the building. And this is how the building looks today. The limestone panels covering the windows were applied in the 1960s when the State Museum adaptively used this building. Inside on the main floor, you can admire these pairs of Roman Doric columns. They have sheet metal shafts, marbleized to look very realistically like marble. In between is a lunette-shaped mural of cherubs painted by the noted interior decorator William F. Behrens. I don't think there's any question that one of the most imposing Greek-inspired buildings in the state of Indiana is this building, the Central Library of the Indianapolis Public Library at 40 St. Clair Street, built between 1915 and 17, and designed by Paul Philadelphia, who won a national architectural competition. And let's focus our attention on this colonnade of Greek Doric columns standing in anise in this recession with these projecting pavilions on either side. Let's take a closer look at the column. You can see that Cray has carefully recreated a Greek Doric column, such as the Parthenon in the abacus, the echinus, and the shaft, fluted shaft, but instead of having no base, he has an 8-sided base. So there's a creative license taken. And if we look at the entablature above, another change, we have an architrave, which is as we would expect, but the frieze has no triglyphs, which are a staple of Greek Doric architecture. Instead, we have bas-relief sculptures here, a little bit like on the Parthenon. Now, investigating churches of this period and Jewish temples, I found that there were several of these that had Greek or Roman First Church of Christ Scientists, it stands at 2011 North Meridian Street, built between 1911 and 12, designed by Rubish and Hunter. And they have carefully followed the Greek detailing, haven't they, with these this tetrastyle, four columns of Doric columns properly sculpted, forming a portico with a Greek Doric entablature with these triglyphs and then an empty pediment above. Interesting thing, the architects created 3 stairways that approach the portico from 3 sides instead of just the frontal side. Here's the building today, been well preserved by the Julian Center. But one change has been made at some point in the past. There's no longer stairways on 3 sides. There's just one approaching it from the front side. Here's another Christian Science church influenced by classicism, the former Second Church of Christ Scientists, now Traders Point Christian Church at 12 4th Street. This was built between 1912 and 13. And a father-son architecture team designed this, Solon Spencer Beeman and Spencer Solon Beeman of Chicago. And the elder Beeman was quite prominent in this new denomination, the Christian Science Church. He believed, taking note of the fact that the Christian Science modeled themselves on early Christian congregations, he said, well, those congregations existed during the Roman Empire, therefore, The most appropriate architecture is Roman-style architecture for Christian Science churches. As we can see in his solution for this building, we have a screen of colossal Roman Doric columns with a large porch recessed within, and then triglyphs forming a Greek-inspired entablature. This is a most interesting building. In 1910, the Orthodox Jewish congregation Shara Tassila desired to build a new building at 601 South Meridian Street. They hired Indianapolis architect George Bedell, and for the facade, he applied a Greek Ionic portico from Greek architecture. You can read this either as a shallow portico or as an edicule with twin columns on either side of a doorway. These well-proportioned columns support an entablature, which has geometric symbols and a Hebrew script in the center, and then a projecting pediment with more geometric figures within. The other thing to note on the side, sort of a transept-like projection, has a flat two-dimensional edicule with these flat pilasters projecting pediment. But within is not Greek elements, but it's a Gothic element, namely a rose window. So an interesting combination of elements that Bedell used. This building is a large building. It was originally built by the St. Paul Methodist Episcopal Church. Since 1955, it has been the home of the Christ Missionary Baptist Church at 1001 Eugene Street, built in 1910. And the thing to note, which really dominates, is this flat, fairly flat, slightly projecting temple front, Greek Doric temple front, all in brick, with the shafts are brick. And then we have these Doric capitals, which has had some creative changes made to them, but probably made of limestone. And then we have a brick frieze, which is a blank frieze, and then a projecting pediment with bas-relief sculptures within. This is one of the most interesting designs I found. This is a drawing made of the proposed Second Baptist Church by an architect, William O. Morrick, in 1911. The Second Baptist congregation was the second oldest African-American congregation in the city. In 1911, they needed a new building, so they hired Morrick to design a vision of what it might look like. And this majestic kind of building he designed has Roman elements in it, namely a Roman-style portico with Roman Corinthian columns supporting an entablature and a projecting cornice, standing on a podium as in a Roman temple, and above that, a Renaissance-style dome. Now, unfortunately, the congregation was not able to raise sufficient funds to realize that vision, so they raised money over a longer period of time, probably hired a different architect, and who finally designed a different kind of design, this is the final design as constructed for the Second Baptist Church at what was 428 West Michigan Street, built in 1919 to 20. And we see the focal point is this elongated Greek Doric portico with these squared columns, an unusual touch, and then an entablature and a pediment. And the sides are more shallow pavilions coming forward, which instead of squared columns have flat pilasters. Now this is what the facade looks like today. It has newer housing units are behind it, but the facade has been preserved with the same columns and pilasters intact. In the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, the Catholic diocese desired to build St. Peter's and Paul Cathedral. They had a site for it at 1347 North Meridian Street. They hired a New York architect, William W. Renwick. Renwick had designed two things. He designed the nave and the transepts in a separate design for the facade. Well, the diocese was unable to raise the funds for the facade, so they said to the architect, build the rest of the church and design a temporary facade. So this is what the temporary facade looked like. It is distinguished, though, was distinguished by a large thermal window from Roman architecture, and also from Roman architecture we had this shallow or short porch of Roman Tuscan columns. Now, about 30 years later, the diocese was able to raise money for a permanent facade. They hired August Boland to design this facade, which owes much to Roman temple architecture with these colossal Corinthian columns, with fluted shafts, a large entablature, and a pediment supported by consoles, and then more the sides, these colossal Greek pilasters, all from Roman sources. And if you think back to the first Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, I think you see a decided resemblance between the two. This brings us to the most stupendous classical design in Indiana history, or perhaps any other place in the United States. The Indiana World War Memorial Plaza. The National Architectural Competition was held in the early 1920s, won by Walker and Weeks of Cleveland. This is their model from after they were chosen, showing the community and the state how this would look. This immense 5-block long plaza with a memorial building in the center being the centerpiece. This was designed and commemorate the valor and sacrifice of Indiana's World War I veterans. Here's a recent aerial view showing most of the plaza. It's an immense city, beautiful layout, bound together by major axes, minor axes, and diagonal axes. The centerpiece of which, without any doubts, is this immense memorial building. Now, what was the inspiration for that, do you suppose? Well, without any question, I think, and it's been concluded that the model was the tomb of King Mausolus at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, built in the 4th century BC. The thing is, though, no one knows exactly what this building looked like, and several possibilities have been drawn, such as this one, which we're looking at. And what did this design consist of? Well, it designed of 3 podia, stepped in character, supporting a screen, a complete screen of colossal ionic columns, within which was a cellar-like structure, at the top of which was a stepped pyramidal roof, and at the very apex was a statue of Mausolus in his chariot with his horse. We take a look at the building as built, we can see some definite differences and changes that Walker and Weeks made. They have a 1-story podium at the lowest level, then a spacious terrace, in the center of which is this monumental square building with no complete colonnade around all 4 sides. Instead, we have a portico of ionic columns, colossal columns, supporting an entablature with a flat roof. The element that's the same is this pyramidal roof with steps. Now we go inside of several spectacular spaces. Let's begin with a foyer modeled on a Greek or Roman temple cella with ionic colonnade of these marble columns with green marble shafts, and then above a cove ceiling with Roman coffers. But the ultimate experience is to be gained by going up to the shrine room, this 100-foot high shrine room. On 4 sides as these colonnades or screens of colossal Corinthian columns with pink marble shafts from St. Albans, Vermont, and these detailed gilded Corinthian capitals. And then if you look up, you're greeted with this vision. The inside of this inverted pyramid, styled to look like the heavens with blue light symbolizing stars, and below that stands the crystal star of destiny. Well, I hope this has given you a variety of views of the classical architecture in Indianapolis and its many different sources, and will inspire you to go out and look at some of these buildings. These are some of the sources I used. And sources for the photos and illustrations. Now, as Brad said, we have on sale and for signing both volumes of my book, Architecture in Indianapolis, 1820 and 1920. And this is volume 1, which covers the first 80 years. And this is volume 2, which covers an explosion of construction in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
I think we've got time to take just a couple of questions, but Dr. Glass will be in the lobby afterwards if you have more questions that don't get answered. So if you've got a question, raise your hand.
Questions? No one's curious about anything? Yes.
Yes, let me get them all.
Other than the building of the circle, what else led to the destruction of all the beautiful buildings that you showed first from 1830? They were gorgeous.
Well, I guess you could say you can't fight progress. No, I mean, that's the sort of the cycle of urban development in this country, isn't it? People build some rather impressive buildings, and they have limitless resources, new forests all around to build more buildings, unlimited material seemingly to build things. And so those are replaced with larger scale buildings, and maybe that generation gets demolished in another 60 or 70 years. Hopefully, as is witnessed by this organization, we've made a lot of progress in how people feel about such things.
Okay. He's coming over here.
This is just a comment, but the last time I was in the throne room of the War Memorial downtown, which was about 30 years ago, but it kind of freaked me out. Like I really thought it was kind of ugly, and wondered if you would comment on this. You have to go inside and see it.
Which room?
I think it's called the throne room, or the big deal interior thing where,
Oh, the auditorium?
yeah,
Has Pershing, a photo of General Pershing on the stage? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure about General Pershing.
How do you feel about the shrine room?
No, it's the shrine room I'm talking about.
Oh, all right.
That kind of freaked me out.
And that you thought was maybe ugly, or
Pardon me?
that was ugly, or,
Yes,
okay,
yes.
well, beholder, I guess.
Go. I encourage people to go see it.
You know, one of the interesting things in all my years in Indianapolis is if I talk to somebody who's been raised in the city, chances are they've never been in the War Memorial Building.
Right.
How many of you have been in the War Memorial Building? Well, good for you. This is a good group.
All right, with that, we will let Dr. Glass get out to the lobby and sign books. So please take advantage of that. And thank you all very much for coming and supporting Indiana Landmarks.